Hello again, here we are looking at clause 612 of ISO 27001, and the topic here is information security risk assessment. So in preceding videos we've looked at the general application of actions to address risks and opportunities both for ISO 9001 and ISO 27001. And we saw that there's very little difference in the text up to this point in particular. For 612 and 613 of 27001, we look at information security, risk assessment and risk treatment. So it goes beyond actions to address risks and opportunities, and it looks for specific risk assessment criteria. So let's look at it in detail. The organization shall define and apply an information security risk assessment process that A, establishes and maintains information security risk criteria that include 1, the risk acceptance criteria, and 2, criteria for performing information security risk assessments. B, ensures that repeated information security risk assessments produce consistent, valid, and comparable results. So let's pause there for a moment. I think Enable ISO customers will be familiar with the organizational risk and business continuity policy. That establishes the criteria that this particular clause is looking for. So it sets out the framework and it describes the process for carrying out risk assessments and so on. I think what an auditor is going to be looking for here is that is then applied, and in particular, when we go back to clause 611, it asks us to draw in those issues from the contextual issues register of clause 4.1 and assess them and have established risk acceptance criteria. I think those familiar with the register will remember that we have a risk description column which contains establishes the risk acceptance criteria within that description. The criteria for performing information security risk assessments is adequately described in the policy. At B, it says ensures that repeated information security risk assessments produce consistent, valid, and comparable results. And the best way to describe that is, again, through the register, we have a scoring mechanism that has provides more than adequately for this need to be consistent with the mechanism that you use to carry out risk assessments. I guess the requirement to be proportionate to the risk, we will look at that, when we come to 613 for risk treatments. Really, the auditor is going to be looking for that you assess things in realistic terms with regard to the potential impact and the likelihood, notwithstanding the fact that regardless of how low the likelihood of something happening, and the potential impact might be quite high, so you might still have to do something about it even though the likelihood might be very remote. So at this point I'd like to just pause and we can move on in a moment, but for those of you who haven't watched the preceding videos, it would be worthwhile going back and doing that now. Continuing on to point C of 612, information security risk assessments. The organisation is required to have a risk assessment process that identifies the information security risks as follows. 1, apply the information security risk assessment process to identify risks associated with the loss of confidentiality, integrity, and availability for information within the scope of the information security management system. And 2, identify the risk owners. Okay, so identifying the information security risks with regard to confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So the impacts will be on the confidentiality and or integrity and or availability of the information. So for example, having an information platform online where customers have their own account, under GDPR, we're required to make sure that the login and access to that account information is available to the customer at all times and only down for notified purposes. So you might have advance notice of periods of downtime for maintenance and so on. And most of you will be familiar with getting that type of notification from the banks, since as they're maintaining and doing upgrades to their website, to give you plenty of advance warning for the periods of downtime. I think, notwithstanding that, availability is only one thing, and integrity and confidentiality, of course, are two different things. For confidentiality, it's all about cybersecurity and preventing unauthorized access. With regard to integrity, well, for software engineering companies out there particularly, there's a bit of a red flag there, because the regulator would see you guys as being in a position to manipulate the data, and that failures on the software can lead to potential impacts on the data subject and on the data. So I think it's just a word of caution there with regard to software engineering in particular. But likewise, anybody who can have impact on how data is being manipulated in an organization, well, then the integrity of the data is obviously, under exposed to risk, I suppose. And to continue, the identifying the risk owner, I think, just to refer to the total management system, on the contextual issues register, we have a nominated management representative, and that person, as named on the register, would be responsible for the risk. I think with regard to within the processing environment, the only acceptable way of dealing with this is that, without naming the person individually, which can be impossible if you've got a large workforce, for example, I think it's always the case that the person carrying out the task owns the risk. So we have to make sure then that's a very important point, by the way, the person carrying out the task can be the only person who could own the risk, because they're the person who ultimately, the risk assessment and risk treatment process can only mitigate so far. Human responsibility towards making sure that the controls are applied properly and the task is carried out in the way it's supposed to be, to make sure that all things are considered appropriately. Well, they own the residual risk that's contained within that activity. So it's very important that organizations that are going for ISO standards, they've got to be able to demonstrate to the auditor that they've made that person aware. And we look at that awareness and training through clause 7, but you've got to be able to show that you've identified, what the risk is, and make sure that the person carrying out the task is aware of the residual risk. So we've given you PPE, but you might still drop the sledgehammer on your toe. So, there's always that kind of consideration. I think to move on, at point D, and the requirement is for the process to analyze the information security risks. One, to assess the potential consequences that would result if the risks identified were to materialize. So that's the term we use in the registers that are under the risk description we provide for the consequences of inaction. So the risk description will describe the impact of the risk if we were to do nothing. And I think that's the starting point. Then you then prioritize from there. 2, assess the realistic likelihood of the occurrence of the risks identified. Straightforward enough. I mean, think about it. I remember in one of my early consultancy agreements with a company where a senior auditor was auditing, and that particular auditor was being assessed by UCAS at the time. And we had 2 minor findings. One was one was sensible enough. The fire extinguisher, heads up you guys in Cork at Smartech, but the fire extinguisher was mounted on the wall outside of the server room door, and the auditor maintained that if you were to go into the server room and discover a fire, that you would have to go outside of the room to get the fire extinguisher and not have it available to you while in the room. So that was an easy fix, move the fire extinguisher. And the other one was an easy fix too, but the likelihood level was very low. The auditor maintained that from a warehouse premises at some 200 meters distance away from the building. A person with a telephoto lens could be on top of the roof and see in through the financial controller's window and be able to take a shot of, the financial controller's computer screen. That was easily fixed by ordering a diffuser from an office supplier online during the audit and providing evidence that that was on the way. So it's just to show that even though the likelihood of somebody being on the roof with a telephoto lens to take a photograph of the financial controller's information, that was very low. But the potential impact could be quite high, particularly if it's a commercial rival and so on. So that's just a word to do with the likelihood and what you need to think of with regard to sighting of equipment as a mitigative expression. Okay, so at 3 there, we've got to determine the levels of risk. Look, we prioritize it and we use a scoring mechanism when the score that's produced indicates us to how we're going to prioritize and how we're going to determine what we're going to do. And we're addressing that now with point E. Evaluates the information security risks to 1, compare the results of risk analysis with the risk criteria established in clause 612A above, and 2, prioritize the analyzed risk for risk treatment. So those of you familiar with the contextual issues of the process risk register, you'll be familiar with the layout and how we provide for the description of the risk. Once you've decided you're going to do something about it, which is to reduce the risk. So you provide a description of the risk, and then we go back and we make sure that we test that for suitability and effectiveness. But prioritizing comes about through the scoring mechanism, and the risk treatment is adequately described then within, and we deal with that in clause 613. Lastly, it just says as a note, the organisation shall retain documented information about the information security risk assessment process. So the documentation we have in our total management system is twofold. Number one, we have that policy document, the organisational risk and business continuity policy statement. And then we have the TMS registers, which has 2 elements for risk. Firstly, the contextual issues register, which is what this area is really looking at through clause 6, is drawing in the issues that we've determined in clause 4.1 as a result of analysis of 4.2, of course. But you're drawing in those contextual issues, those the cybersecurity threats, the external pressures, the market pressures, and so on, and they're to be determined on how they may impact on information security. So I think, without going any further, I'd just like to say it is an area that is, well, very subjective to, the auditor has to maintain objectivity with regard to the criteria of the standard. But you as a person looking to apply the criteria, well, you need to be very subjective and very matter of fact and proportioned. In other words, firstly, consider when applying mitigations, look to what's available to you with regard to technical controls. And sometimes you might need a little bit of consultancy there because you may not be familiar with what you have available to you with regard to encryption, malware protection, and so on. So if you're not a technical person, get some technical advice. You can always contact us on the website through the chat box, or indeed you can send us an email or contact your consultant directly, and we'll be delighted to take your call. Thank you.